Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're heading into some new territory with a brand new guest. Her name is Judika Illis. She has written an amazing book called Witches, a Compendium, and she has dropped by today to talk to us all about the book and witches and witchcraft and all sorts of things. So Judika, welcome to the podcast and thanks for making time for me.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I have a lot of questions about your book, a lot of questions for you. And I'll do my best to frame those questions in a moment. But first, before we get into all of that in the book, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe some of the work that you do for people who aren't familiar with you and your
Sure.
work? Who is Judika Illis? And tell us what we need to know.
I was born in New York City. I am a native New Yorker, but and I have loved witches and the magical arts ever since I can remember. Ever since I can remember, since I was tiny. My mother loved fairy tales. My mother taught herself English by reading to me, and we read a lot of fairy tales, and I was always Team Witch, even um, from the beginning. I've never liked the Hansel and Gretel story because, the witch dies,
Yeah.
which is not typical in most fairy tales. Uh, I was a bit of a late bloomer. I mean, these were personal interests for me for a very long time. I started studying the magical arts, astrology and numerology and card reading, and it just all fascinated me, but it was very personal. And then in I was, 40 really before I was published. And I am the author of numerous books at the time, mainly nonfiction books about spell casting, about spirits. I've got a book on saints, maybe an unconventional book on saints, but and some of them are encyclopedias. Some of them are smaller books like this. I call this my mini encyclopedia because it's a small book.
Mhm.
I am also an editor, and I work for full transparency. I am an editor for Wiser Books. I used to work for the Witches Almanac as an editor, um, and I still read cards for people. I don't advertise it, but if people ask me to read their cards, I will. Um, and that's who I am.
If you don't mind me asking, what was faith like growing up in your home? Like what was your faith tradition maybe when you were younger? How were you raised to think about those kind of things?
Oh, Jewish,
Hmm.
Jewish. My refugees from Europe. My parents are Hungarian Jewish refugees,
Hmm.
and not neither. My parents were spiritual people,
Hmm.
maybe mystical people. I don't come. I mean, people will tell you I come from hereditary witchcraft. I don't. I don't know if they do either, to be very honest, most of them. But I came from people. I had one. I learned how to read very early because that's how my parents had just come from Europe, just a couple of years before I was born,
Hmm.
and that's how my mother, as I was saying, taught herself English. We had a lot of books in the house. We were readers. So we had astrology books. We had numerology books. We had Zen Buddhism books. I mean, I was
Hmm.
exposed to a lot of stuff. They, I was not made to read it, but nobody, I was the only child. My closest sibling is 12 years older than me.
Hmm.
So I was like a puppy, essentially. They let me do whatever I wanted to do within reason, as long as I wasn't getting in trouble.
Sure.
I, you know, so if there was a book in the house and I read it, no one bothered me. Like no one censored anything. They wouldn't explain it to me.
Hmm.
I mean, I read The Godfather very young. I read like adult books pretty young because
Wow.
I'm a compulsive reader.
Yeah.
If there's nothing to read, I will read the back of the cereal box. That's, so no one would ever explain anything to me, but th they didn't stop me. They just let me understand things as I understood them. I joke that I read in school. I read Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises three times before I ever even understood what the war wound was.
Right. Hmm.
So but I mean I'm people ask me like about Christianity. I'm not a Christian. I've never been a Christian. No one is a Christian. I have I have Catholic relatives,
Hmm.
and I come from a very tolerant background. I was, I have relatives on the whole spectrum I mean, I do have extremely religious Jewish relatives. I have Catholic relatives. Uh, no one ever said anything negative about any of them. It was sort of
Mm,
a personal choice.
I love that. So I brought you on the show today because I wanted to ask you some questions about, I guess, related to my own upbringing,
Sure.
because myself and a lot of our listeners were raised in more conservative Christian circles,
You know,
that where a lot of things were very off limits. And so we were
well,
taught, like for myself, I can remember being taught, that witches are of the devil and their
sure.
purpose is to pull us away from God and lead us to hell. And I don't believe those things anymore, but I still have a lot of lingering questions since that was drilled into my head for 35 years.
One of the reasons I always tell people I'm from New York because I think that's a very significant thing about my spirituality.
Hmm.
I'm not, and I don't know if people are familiar with New York City. When people talk about New York City, they assume you're speaking of Manhattan,
Hmm.
Manhattan Island. New York City is made up of five boroughs,
Yeah.
and Manhattan Island is, the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, and in the movies, you're most likely to see, unless you're watching Spider-Man, you are most likely to see Manhattan because Spider-Man, like me, is from Queens.
Yeah.
The outer boroughs are more residential, and I'm from Queens. And Queens is considered to be the most diverse, one of the most diverse places, if not the most diverse places on earth. If you go
Hmm.
into a hospital, the instructions will be in something like 20 languages. And that is a big factor of who I am. I grew up with a lot of people who are not the same as me and who
Hmm.
didn't believe the same thing and didn't eat the same thing. And I I come from tolerant people. I was never told stay away from those people. They're bad,
Yeah.
you know, or they will lead you to the devil or something
Yeah.
like that. So that is a big part of my spirituality. I hear it from other people, but I did not hear that in my formative years.
Yeah. I think that's so important because again, in my upbringing, that's not what it was. I mean, we had a very singular, narrow focus of understanding and belief, and anything that fell outside of that, even a little bit, was way off limits. And so there's so many different things in your world that were just off limits to me. And so I go to the bookstore all the time and I always go down the spirituality aisle and your encyclopedias are there and your book of spells is there. And I'm like, man,
Yeah.
this is just so interesting to me. And I've picked up these books and I've like looked through them. I'm like, man, this is like nothing at all like I was told that it is. And so I was really excited to have you on the show today to kind of help me drag some of these topics into the light, so to speak, because I found on my own journey that a lot of the things that I've been told to keep in the dark, to lock it up in the closet and throw away the key, there's a lot of, fear surrounding those things because there's a lot of misunderstanding around them. There's a lot of, it's an off topic kind of a
Hmm.
thing. But I'm finding with this podcast, when I invite someone like yourself on to just ask some genuine, heartfelt questions that might sound stupid to somebody who lives in the world that you live in, but to me, it's like
No,
these are
no.
all such new information. It helps dispel a lot of the fears, and I've had a lot of listeners say, "Man, like that person brought a perspective to this conversation I never knew before." And so that's what I wanted to do with you today.
I had to be talked into writing both my Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells and my Encyclopedia of Witchcraft by the publisher because I wanted to write something different.
Hmm.
But one of the factors that convinced me is that I wanted a book that was written from the inside because a lot of these books, like if you'll read there are other Encyclopedia of Witchcrafts, they're written by observers,
Hmm.
whether they're academics or they're fans. But I wanted to write from the inside. I wanted to represent, so I could have been an academic writer, and I'm
Hmm.
not, but this is why.
Yeah, it's like your lived experience. All right, so let's start with if you don't mind, the basics
Sure.
questions. Like what? Again, like this might seem very surface level, but how would you define a witch? What is witchcraft? I know
Well,
the religion Wicca. I know some people who are witches follow that, some people don't. So maybe a general overview of some of these terms, then we'll go from there.
it's a tricky thing because in a lot of languages, they
Hmm.
have different words for different types of well, we would witches, but in the English language, and this is something that I do write about, in the English language, we have one word that it's an umbrella term. It encompasses so many things, and they're not the same thing. I also would caution that everybody thinks they know what a witch is. You ask a 6-year-old, what's a witch? Draw me a picture of a witch. They'll tell you something. And so when people ask me, are you a witch? I always ask them, what do you think a witch is?
Mm.
Because if you think a witch is someone who, desecrates cemeteries and eats babies, no, absolutely not. I am
No.
not that. That's not me. Um, the word witch is an Anglo-Saxon word. It derives from an Anglo-Saxon root word that has to do with wisdom. It has literally, and also in other languages, particularly Indo-European languages, the word witch often, if you break it down to the root word, it translates as the one who knows. And what do they know? Well, they know things that are maybe specialized information. And I always think back to, if you imagine, every one of us walking around today is a walking miracle. Because if you are alive today, that means every single one of your ancestors lived long enough to reproduce. And somebody cared enough to keep that baby alive. And human history, the history of humans, even if they're not exactly humans in the way we're humans, they're, all these anthropologists are finding, thousands of years ago. I mean, that's a long lineage. So that is an amazing thing. And they talk about the earliest migrations of people. And if you think about it, people leaving wherever, before the internet, there were no newspapers, people were isolated. People would go, you would travel to find a better place for some reason. And when you get there, what are you going to eat? What kind of, and I'm a person who believes in spirits, so I'm going to, other people may not. What kind of spirits are there?
Mm.
Are these helpful, friendly spirits? Or are these going to be angry spirits who don't want you there? Are are there poisonous plants? Are there beneficial plants? Imagine thousands and thousands of years ago, the the ancestors of modern witches and shamans, people today, are the people who figured those things out.
Mm.
Even today, Amazonian shamans, you'll ask them, how did you know this was a good plant for this, for this remedy? And they'll say, the plant told me. And that's very ancient and very primordial. And I do think that in some ways, witchcraft and shamanism, and I think it's hard to separate them in the earliest days, although you can now, are maybe the earliest religions.
Mm.
And I think people also imagine somebody who knows more than you do, who knows which plants are the poisonous ones and which are the beneficial ones. And a lot of, if anybody who knows botany, some plants look like mushrooms. Some plants look very, very much alike.
Yeah.
You have to be careful of picking mushrooms because sometimes, especially to the untrained eye, the mushroom that you might think will make a good dinner is indistinguishable
Mm.
from the mushroom that will just, you'll be dead in minutes. So there is fear. I think that fear starts there.
Mm.
People who know more than other people. Um, and and there were times when we know, because as you get into recorded history, some of the earliest witches and magicians are associated with blacksmith clans, with metal workers.
Mm.
And those are family secrets. So I think that the fear starts there. Witches, to me, witchcraft is about power. It's about personal power and autonomy. And a lot of it is people, there are two kinds of witchcraft. There's religious Wicca. And some people use those names. You have to kind of ask people. It's not hard and fast. Some people use those names sort of simultaneously for the
Mhm.
same thing. And I don't when I write because it's not clear. Wicca is a religion, and you'll find a lot of churches of Wicca these days. It was in its modern form. It is founded by a man called Gerald Gardner, who was and I have bios for him in my witches book,
Hmm.
who in other books, I mean, he's a famous person and an author who was a British man who actually was a colonist in Malaya, what was then Malaya. And then he came back to Britain. His wife, when he retired, wanted to come back to Britain, and he did. And he was always fascinated by mysticism and folk practices. His first published book was a book on, in Indonesia, they had these magical curved knives, and he was a collector, and that was his first book.
Mm.
And he came to Britain and he was looking for, he was looking for witchcraft, the magical traditions of the British Isles. And he found it and he sort of formalized it. And so there's something called Gardnerian Wicca, and it's like Protestant denominations.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
Congregationalists are a little bit different from
You're right.
Presbyterians, are different from Baptists. You'll find a lot of Wiccan denominations, and often a lot of Wiccans are people who come from the church, particularly from Protestant churches. And so you may find familiarity with some of the structures because essentially the religious heart has changed. Wiccans in general venerate the masculine and the feminine divine, the
Mm.
Lord and the Lady, the God and the Goddess.
Mm.
They may or not be spellcasters. They may or not, you know, they may or not approve of spellcasting.
Mm.
That's, because that's a religious tradition. And as I was saying, that's not my tradition.
Mm.
Although it is really sort of seeped into the cultural consciousness. I grew up in New York City and or right around New York City, and there was a style. Everything's kind of gotten homogenized lately with the internet, but there were local styles, regional styles of
Mm.
magical working, and in New York City, there was you would as we were saying before, as we're talking, it's the holiday of Imbolc, which is really based on ancient Irish practices. But it's I have a phone full of Imbolc blessings this morning, which is really nice, and I've been sending them too. So it is people who are not religious Wiccans may still celebrate what the Wiccans call Sabbats, their festivals.
Mm.
Witches, and that's Wicca with a capital W,
Mm.
because as Christianity with a capital C, it's a religion, and there are rites and festivals just like any
Sure.
other religion. Witchcraft is a practice. It's an art, it's a craft, it's an art and a craft. They call it the craft with a capital C.
Mm.
But in general, that is magical practice, and witches come in uh, all religions. They may or may not use that word witch depending where they're from, uh, but magical practitioners. And witch is a loaded word. I often call myself an occultist instead.
Mm.
I'm a student of the magical arts, because I mean, you do get the people who assume you're like, digging up graves.
Right. It carries a lot of
You know,
baggage, that word.
it carries a lot of baggage, and you have to be careful. And for all the fear about witches, the witches will lead us to the devil, witches will do this or that. If you look at the historical data, it's actually the witches who have been persecuted.
That's right.
The witches aren't the ones burning people.
Yeah.
So you do have to, when people ask you, are you a witch? Is it because they think that's terrific? Or is it because, they've got a lighter ready to go?
Right.
So
Right.
you have to be careful. And
Yeah.
I would advise that to anybody.
Yeah.
Um, but they come in all colors, all sizes, all genders, all
Mm.
spiritual beliefs, all political beliefs. There are sometimes stereotypes of that, but you will witches are everywhere,
Mm.
and they practice different things. And that was one of the things I wanted to put into my witches book, to show you the different kinds of things, the different kinds of belief systems. There are atheist witches who don't believe in it. They might believe in elemental spirits, land spirits, but They don't believe in a creator, for example.
Sure.
And then there are, all kinds of people who are devoutly spiritual in different religious, different in different ways.
Mm. So this next question might be, with all that in mind, difficult to answer, but like what are some things that modern day witches do? And like again, because you just mentioned, and I thought you do a beautiful job in the book, but I think the way you just explained it is so helpful for someone who comes from my background, because as a Christian, there's many different avenues of Christianity, and there's many different denominations, and
Right,
there's what one person means by Christian, someone else means something entirely different. And I can remember sitting in seminary listening to a professor talk about witches and thinking to myself, this sounds like way like if Wicca is a religion, it sounds like the explanation I'm being given is far too narrow, because if my own faith is so wide and so
right,
broad in so many different ways, it would make sense that someone else's faith, as different as it might be from my own, would also
right.
have the same
Sure.
breadth to it. So again, like what are some different things that like a modern day witch might do?
I think the the commonalities of witchcraft is that it's an attempt to walk in harmony with the physical world and and the spiritual aspects, mystical aspects of that world. We had this beautiful new moon just a couple days ago. And I went outside to see it, and I am very aware of moon cycles,
Hmm.
and to harmonize with sort of the seasons and the powers of the earth and the ocean, and to be very aware of your landscape, the winds. I think that is something, whether you are a witch out in the country, and that's often the stereotype of the witch. They're out in the country a lot. I'm an urban girl. I've never, I hate camping. I'm not, whether you're in the city or in the country, wherever you are, to sort of harmonize yourself with the location
Hmm.
and to pay attention to signs and energies. I think that is something that is pretty common to all practitioners of magic.
Hmm.
Beyond that, you know, there are witches who are astrologers, but there are also astrologers who are not witches. I I've been a tarot card reader. I mean, it's fascinated with tarot cards since I was a child. But I've met tarot card readers who absolutely have no interest in anything beyond
Hmm.
that divination. It's I think that what witches have in common is independence. And I think this is actually the root of what gets them in trouble. Witches are very much, I'll fix it. It's my life. This is how I'm going to live it.
Hmm.
Uh, that they're not obedient. They're not obedient. They're not they're not inclined to, they might be law abiding. You know, I don't, I stop at stop signs.
Right.
I know a lot of plenty of people don't stop at stop signs,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
I stop at stop signs. So, law abiding, you might be law abiding, but you're also that desire to live an autonomous life where people aren't going to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
They're not going to tell you what to think. They're not going to tell you what to believe. In the witch hunting eras in Europe, that was one of the complaints. Instead of going to church on Sunday, those witches were out gallivanting at night having fun. They brought the devil into the story, but what are they doing with the devil?
Yeah.
They're having sex. They're dining, they're feasting, they're dancing. They're not doing their housework.
Hmm.
You know, they're not a lot of stereotypes of witches have to do with hair. They're they're not covering their hair.
Hmm.
They're not binding up their hair. They're not dressing the way they're supposed to. One of the I mean, Bridget Bishop, who was among the witches, so-called witches, who were executed in Salem Village, the evidence against her, she wore a red petticoat. That wasn't, you know, that was considered evidence of witchcraft.
Mm,
So I think that that independent spirit, and that I think that is something that all sorts of authority, from religious authority to secular authority, a lot of people blame Christianity for anti-witch feelings, but it goes back earlier.
mm,
Pagan Rome was not a witch-friendly society. Quite the opposite. And I mean, one of the earliest witch hunts is conducted, by pagan Rome. So that, but it was, a very conservative militaristic society, and you had these women going out having fun.
mm.
So,
Yeah, well, I think like we said earlier, I think before we hit record, that fear is one of the best ways to control people. If you can generate fear, like these women are out doing these things, they're not being obedient to the men, the patriarchy, they're not coming to church, they're going elsewhere to get their direction. Like that's a bad thing. And so let's just tie the devil into it as well, and let's throw all that stuff into the mix and create all this fear around these people, and then it becomes easier uh, to justify burning at the stake and all those different kind of things
it's
because
worth reading old. I mean, and there are records, there's documents, old
hmm
witchcraft trial testimony. There is a very famous case, and Isabel Gowdy, I, who I write about in my book, Witches, and this is my mini encyclopedia. And I say that because if people are interested in these things, I have a big 800 plus page encyclopedia that has more detail. But you can read Isabel Gowdy's trial testimony as she allegedly turned herself in as a witch in Scotland. And her original testimony talks about she's off with the fairies, the queen of fairies, the queen of Elfhame. And it doesn't satisfy her inquisitors, and they eventually bring the devil. They start bringing the devil into it. So she starts off talking about fairies, and at the end she's talking about the devil. And we don't know. We don't know whether there was torture involved. We don't know.
yeah.
There's a lot of gaps there, but it's interesting to read.
Yeah. So in chapter one and two of the book, you talk about different types of witchcraft, and then you talk about different figures in
Right.
witchcraft who've been important. And I thought was really interesting is in chapter one, you talk about something called Jewitry. And
Oh yeah.
then in chapter two, you talk about Moses from the Old Testament and how he has been called the great voodoo man of the Bible. And that really intrigued me because, again, all of my life being told witchcraft is evil and bad. And yet here it is, having roots in my own tradition, as Christianity obviously has roots in Judaism. So I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit more
Well,
about that. I don't really have any question, but just like more about like
sure. Well,
Jewitry and Moses.
Moses is the great voodoo man is easier because that's a reference from the author Zora Neale Hurston,
Hmm.
who was an anthropologist and very. I mean, her books are in print. She's most famous for a book called "Their Eyes Were Watching God," but y- you know, if you read the biblical story, the Bible is very, and I say this as a person who had a lot of Jewish education,
Hmm.
so it's a different perspective. The Bible is very ambivalent towards magic. It's not the Old Testament anyway. It's not necessarily negative about it. I mean, Moses is competing with the Egyptian magicians. And, there's a legend that the Pharaoh had to import magicians from Mali,
Hmm.
farther in Africa, to even because, like, Moses who was raised in Egypt, and the Egyptians were famous for their magical arts and may be the last totally magic friendly society that we know of.
Hmm.
But, he's cast, that his rod is turning into all kinds of things. And the ability, and Zora Neale Hurston, who did a lot of studies of the voodoo religion in Haiti, saw similarities. And if you look, I mean, it's not inconceivable. I mean, if you look at a map, I mean, next up after Israel is Egypt. You're in Africa,
Yeah.
so I mean, it's not an inconceivable thing. But that was something that she saw, and it's intriguing. And there are a lot of, do you know what a grimoire is? A grimoire is a book of magic
Right.
spells.
Yeah.
And so, the Bible is the five books of Moses, but there's also something called, the six, something that, like the sixth, seventh, and eighth, books of Moses, also which are more magical.
Mm.
I recently edited a book by Harold Roth, which is an ancient grimoire pre-Kabbalah, called the Sword of Moses. Harold's book is the magic of the Sword of Moses,
Mm.
and it's a very interesting book. He just published a book on the Book of Enoch. And I'm just Harold Roth is just a genius, and I'm just so blessed to be able
Mm.
to work with him and be his editor. So there's a lot of magic in there. Jew witchery is that general women, although they don't have to be women, um, who embrace a magical tradition in a Jewish context.
Mm.
And it's not always the same. It's not an official thing. Some people are religious Jews, but also some people are culturally Jewish. Some people are incorporating ancient Hebrew goddesses. And for people who are interested in that topic, there's a really interesting and somewhat academic book called The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai,
Mm.
Patai, my fellow Hungarian. Um, and that's a very, very interesting book, a very scholarly book. You know, this is going to go back to the Witch of Endor, who is also, and we call her commonly the Witch of Endor. And if I say the Witch of Endor, people know what I'm talking about. And of course, from Bewitched, the TV show Endora
Mm.
is named in her honor. But that's actually a mistranslation of the Hebrew. She's not there. Hebrew is one of those languages that has different words for different kinds of practices.
Mhm.
And she's not called the Witch of Endor. She is technically she is a Baalat O. She's the mistress of the O. And
Mm.
what is an O? We don't know. It's possible that it was something that was so common in the biblical era, they didn't bother to define it. Or maybe they didn't want to define it. They think it is something shamanic, that it is something, a way of contacting ancestral spirits.
Mm.
Similar to certain, going back to voodoo, going back to certain types of ritual objects. They think it's similar, and there's a lot of academic works on that.
Mm.
So she might actually be more accurately described as the medium, someone who contacts the dead
Mm.
of Endor, or the shaman of Endor, or sometimes people just call her the woman of Endor.
Mm.
And if you go back and read the story, it's an interesting story, because so King Saul becomes the king, and he banishes all the fortune tellers and the witching women and all, and then he has a problem. And what does he have to do? Then he said he needs one. And I think there's a lot of subliminal messaging there, because the prophet Samuel has advised the children of Israel that kings will be bad for you. They'll take away your liberty. And one of the things he does is he takes away right away their access to this alternative spirituality.
Mm.
And then of course he needs one too. And they find one, because you can banish witches and you can burn witches and you can do whatever. They're not going away,
Yeah.
because I think we're wired for this knowledge.
Mm.
I think this is so ancient, because there are people who want to know. They want to know the inner workings. How does the world work? What does this mean? Which flower will heal you? How do I contact? You know, we don't know where the money is hidden, so we have to find a way to contact great grandma to tell us. you
Right.
know you know so, and she actually, if you read the story, she's very kind.
Mm.
She delivers a very terrible prophecy to him, and she's accurate. She's not a fraud. She does what she says she can do, and she feels bad about it. She knows she gives bad news, and as somebody, I've occasionally had to give bad news. It's not fun.
Mm.
um she cooks for him. You know, she's not portrayed as evil.
Mm,
King James, the word witch gets in there with the English translation, the King James Bible, because King James is actually a person, uh, the person who unites England and Scotland and Wales
mm,
to become the United Kingdom. He becomes King James the First, and he is obsessed with witches. He believes the witches have been trying to kill him, and so he is the one who or his translators are the ones who put that word witch in there. You
mm,
shall not suffer a witch to live. In Greek, the word that they're using for witch could also be translated as poisoner or pharmacist,
mm,
you know? So is it thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live? Or maybe let's get rid of the pharmacists.
mm. Right.
You know, you could interpret that differently. So so and then when you get into sort of Talmudic times, there is this belief that all women are witches, and it's forbidden. You're not supposed to practice this.
Mm,
But what does that mean? All women are witches. That means your mommy is a witch,
mm,
your grandma, your sister, your daughters. And so there's this ambivalence to it. It's not completely negative because, okay, you're not supposed to do this, but I know my wife is a really good person, and if she's a woman, she's probably practicing something. Where
mm,
it is this very tentative, but there are also, religions, plural, where men and women don't necessarily worship in the same way. And I think, we see this in ancient Rome.
mhm,
The god Hercules is only worshipped by men in Rome, not in Greece, but in Rome. And there is a class of goddesses who we know almost nothing about now, the Bonadia, the good goddess, who is only worshipped by women. Men are not allowed to participate in her rites.
mm,
I think Christianity is the religion that comes in and sort of, men and women, we're going to do this together.
yeah,
So, I think that there is a little bit of that in Judaism too.
mm,
This that, because life, the ideal life is that a man can study all the time and be religious all the time and analyze the religion all the time and have a study partner, and it's very, that's what they do, and women are doing the practical things.
mm,
Women are out in the marketplace, women are running the shop, women are raising the kids, and maybe women are doing maybe the more practical aspects of spirituality also.
mm. Just bringing it into the everyday life, into the public sphere.
It's maybe a little bit of a, to I mean to mix a metaphor essentially, but maybe a little yin and yang,
Mm,
to balance the two.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, it's not like Gardnerian Wicca where you have rules,
Mm,
but you do have a lot of people who identify as Jew witches.
yeah. Is
If you
there
Google,
any? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's it.
No, I was gonna say, is there any like looking at like going forward into like the New Testament? Obviously, we have Jesus, and Jesus is doing all of his miracles and doing all these different seemingly magical things, and we have, there's talk about the Magi who, from the
Are
East who were
magicians.
like magicians, and so
The
is there any like
Magi
I'm
are
just
flipped.
curious, is there any like tradition that sees Jesus in
Yes,
that vein as well?
there is a book. uh, I read it years ago, but it's
Mhm.
still in print, by Morton Smith, called Jesus the Magician.
Mhm.
And if that's something that interests you, it's very interesting. There is a publication. Maybe is it the Greek magical papyri, the Greco-Egyptian. I don't remember what it's called. They found a trove of old writings from essentially the time of Jesus. It's a maybe a century or two before the year zero, before the beginning of the Common Era,
Mhm.
and a century or two after, that were found in Alexandria, Egypt, which was, as I was saying about New York City, it was it was essentially great metropolis and maybe the New York City of its time. And it's fascinating. It's just records of magic spells.
Mm,
And they often mix. As I mean, I, now people worry about cultural appropriation, but as a teenager in New York, it was very much a melting pot of magic. And you see it in Alexandria too. And there are references to Jesus in the context of pagan gods also.
mm,
And, this is before the religion was formalized,
yeah.
centuries before. And so you can see, but, maybe there is this blending, like the first Christians, or people who maybe were not Christians but were influenced by Christianity. What you will find with magical practitioners is that magical practitioners like what works, and they will adapt what works to their own spiritual beliefs.
Mm,
And this is very ancient. So there's a temple incense in Egypt called Kaifi. And when the Greeks come into Egypt, they like it.
mm,
And they discover that it has aphrodisiac purposes, which apparently really offended the Egyptians. That was their sacred temple incense.
mm,
But that's what people do. There's an anthropological axiom that nothing crosses the border faster than a magic spell.
mm,
It was one of the reasons I was convinced to write 5,000 spells, is I was able to, a book only has so many pages, so usually you have to pick. If I include this, I can't include something else. But it's a 1,000-page book.
right.
I was able to do variants of spells.
Mm,
Look at this version, look at that version. Uh, there's a there's a spell to control a liar or to control witnesses in a court case that traditionally uses a beef tongue. And people use whatever they have. It's a spell of British origin, and the British eat meat, and
mm,
there's a lot of organ meat spells, things with sheep's hearts, because maybe the parts that they weren't eating, they used for something else.
mm,
But I have a vegan version of that spell. So this is because you have the need, and every magic spell is created by people.
mm,
It's all, it's all figuring out how this is something that seems to work. How can I make it work for me?
yeah. Mm. So your last chapter, which I think is a good segue, what you just said, is how to like ask the question, are you a witch? And you give these I guess these
Oh,
clues that can help somebody determine
yes, and the
whether or not they
stereotypes.
are, yeah, or whether they
Yeah.
if they could be if they wanted to. I was wondering if you
Yeah.
could talk about maybe some of those clues and then just like what does all of this mean for the listener, who the everyday person who's working a 9 to 5 job and they're listening to us
Oh,
talk about this kind of stuff. Like what does this have
yeah.
to do with them?
I wrote that book out of a lot of love.
Hmm.
People ask me, somebody described it as a love song to witches, and I think that's true. It's a celebration of witches. I hear a lot of negative things. I mean, The Wizard of Oz, the original, the MGM musical, I used to dread it as a child. As I'm old enough, something came around once a year on TV.
Right.
You had to watch, everybody gathered around the TV. But I found that a very upsetting movie. That's a movie about killing a witch.
Mm,
And there's not really a reason given. Why is she the Wicked Witch? It's not, she's not the one. I don't know. Dorothy's essentially not necessarily by choice, but Dorothy's the witch killer.
sure.
Um, and so I wanted to share my love. It's not really something you have to be afraid of.
Mm,
Most There are different kinds of power in the world, and there is magical power. The stuff works. You have to, the people ask me, is the spell dangerous? And yes, because you might get what you ask for.
mm,
So be careful what you're asking for. But there are other kinds of power. There's brute force. There's economic power. those are more efficient.
mm,
If you have enough money, or if you're, tough enough and scary enough, it's a lot more, those are more efficient ways to get what you want than, let me tell you, witchcraft is hard sometimes. It's fun, but it can also be hard.
mm,
And it's not predictable. It's mysterious. So if the witches aren't necessarily the ones to be afraid of, and people who are afraid of witches harm people. And I would like to sort of protect the witches also.
mm,
So I think it's good that people understand what witches are. There's a lot of joy there. And I think that is one of the telltale signs, the joy in the elements. Do you love and of course, if the wind has brought the fire to your house and burnt it down, you're not going to love wind. But, those are all very individual things.
mm,
Um, it, I get a lot of emails. I have a book called, if you would like to learn how to cast a spell or be a magical practitioner, I have a book called Pure Magic. There, and that book is a very practical. There's no spiritual agenda. Anybody can use it.
mm,
I'm not telling you what to believe or not believe, but it's just very practical. How do you do it? I think that desire. I used to get a lot of email because I've been publishing now for over 20 years. I get a lot of email from people. I had a psychic experience as a child. I knew grandma was going to die when she died, and it terrified my family, and they beat me. And I think I had capacity, and then I suppressed it, but I'd like to get it back. I have a lot of emails like that, and I
mm,
feel bad for people because the worst thing my family ever did with me was roll their eyes at me. And that's, who cares?
mm,
But I hear people who are beaten, or, locked in a room, or, taken for exorcisms, and not nice exorcisms. So I, I, I would like to sort of share that there's angry people do angry things.
mm,
And it doesn't matter whether they're angry magical practitioners, or they're angry bullies, or they're angry, you should maybe avoid people with a lot of that sort of constant rage,
mm,
especially if it's directed towards you.
mm,
That's a dangerous thing. Magical. So are there angry magical practitioners? Sure. There's angry everything else.
mm,
Every couple of years we hear a story. I mean, the pharmacists. We hear a story about a pharmacist who, you know, saved money by maybe not giving the full dose of medicine, often with fatal consequences. And we're not saying, oh, that's terrible. This one person did this. Now let's burn all the pharmacists. So, is someone out there listening, and they have a relative, or they know someone who has done something magical and it's been angry? That doesn't mean everybody's like that.
mm,
That's an angry person. And we're going to use the tools at hand. What do we have that we can use when we're frustrated, and we're angry, and we're envious,
mm,
and resentful, and all those negative emotions?
mm,
But in my experience, a lot of the people who I know who identify as witches are very loving people. They love animals. I mean, that's a common trait of magical practitioners. They really like animals. They they care about nature. They Because that's where the power comes from.
mm,
They don't want there to be an oil spill, because that's not good for any of us. We don't want microplastics in everything.
mm,
It dilutes the power. So those are things that people probably have in common. A desire for independence, a desire to live life the way you want to live it, a desire to question what people tell you, and to come up with um, your own way of thinking, your own. I mean, it's Gnostic, your own relationship with the divine. So that is and I'm talking about magical practitioners. I'm not necessarily talking about religious
mm,
Wiccans, who, or religious people are religious people, whether, there's a commonality. That's a different commonality.
mhm,
Um, So I think that's what people have in common. There's a lot of stereotypes. And when I learned them, I'm a researcher and I learned them, was very chagrined because I actually do correspond to some of the stereotypes. There is a medieval stereotype that you'll know who the witch is because the witch is the one complaining that the food is too salty. And my kids are the ones who complain that I don't put enough salt in the food. Um, I, I think that a desire for joy in life is rather than, I mean the classic. Have you ever heard the difference between a spell and a prayer?
No.
It was taught to me that a prayer is a request and a spell is a demand.
Mm,
Not thy will be done, my will be done.
mm,
And that is, and if you understand witchcraft as something ancient that levels the playing field, because life is not fair. We're not all born the same. Some people are born healthy. Some people have loving parents.
mm,
Some people are born into wealth or at least prosperity. Some people are born into comfort. And some people have a hard time for one reason or another. And there's no why. Why is someone born without a limb? Why is someone born with a physical condition? Why is someone's parents, or why are they absent or not
mm,
loving? And the magical arts have historically been a way to obtain the life that you want.
mm.
There's a blues lyric that I think a lot. Among the many things I've done, I was a blues disc jockey, and it's a Muddy Waters song. I live the life I love, and I love the life I live, and that is very much the desire, the underlying desire. It it is not so much about controlling other people and unless someone is a controlling person anyway. I mean, are
Sure.
there examples of that? Sure. But we can go through the history of the world and find, plenty of. I always think about Aleister Crowley, who was described as the wickedest man alive. He was a,
Mm,
a foundational character in the history of witchcraft and a very prolific writer. And he's the wickedest man alive. And, in a lot of ways, he wasn't necessarily a nice man. He actually, um, he in his youth he was a child preacher for the Plymouth Brethren. That was the background he came out of. Um, and I think about that because who were his peers? Stalin, Hitler.
mm,
He's not even in the same league. You could keep going. So, but he was, a magical practitioner, a magus, a witch.
mm,
And so he gets, oh, he's the wickedest man alive. You know, not even close.
mm.
I mean, I think he liked it. You know, I think he enjoyed the title, but so sometimes I feel bad, like he's looking down at me saying, don't say that. But
No, it's funny when I listened to you talk and especially when I read that last chapter, I thought to myself like maybe like what if there's a little bit of witchcraft in all of us, so to speak, because like I think of my own journey growing up in the church and I got to this
mhm,
point where I started to ask a lot of questions about my faith and I started to do my own research and digging and that led me to like the Gnostic Christians and I started to realize like how wide the road of my own faith is, and that there's so much room on those different roads for different kinds of
mhm.
people. And just I feel like I'm in this place where, the way that I was brought up to be a Christian doesn't work for me anymore. And so I'm on my journey discovering my own way. And that doesn't
Sure.
make a whole lot of people very happy. That it rocks a lot of people's boats. But I feel like you said, like that's an element of being a witch, so to speak, is finding your own way and not really caring too much about what the establishment might have to say about it.
Well, it's hard. I think people are always when they, I mean, in all walks of life, when people know you, they want they want consistency.
Yeah.
And so maybe that is another characteristic of witchcraft
Mm,
or the inclination towards it, a tolerance for inconsistency, for
Mm,
ambiguity, because life is complex.
yep.
You asked me, and we didn't cover this, about liminality.
Mm, yes.
And the the word liminal refers to threshold spaces. A lot of fairy tales, like in America, we say once upon a time when you start a fairy tale.
Yep.
But in parts of Europe, they say once there was and once there wasn't. So a liminal space is like when you are in the beach and you have 1 foot in the sand and 1 foot in the water.
Mm,
You're in both places at once. It's when the threshold of your door, like you can literally stand on the threshold. Are you inside? Are you outside?
mm,
You can put 1 foot outside, 1 foot inside. Uh, the space thresholds are every place, and that liminal space, the space between thought and speaking.
mm.
There's that there's that second in between, and sometimes a very brief second. I forgot to think about what I was going to say, and
Right.
I blurted it out. But it, the being maybe in two places at once, or in a special place. To be on the land is one thing. To be in the water is another thing. But what if you're kind of in both? That before you're totally on the land, or before you're totally in
Mm,
the water. There are two times of day, twilight and dawn, where you can kind of see the night hasn't left yet. For the crepuscular animals, the night hasn't left yet, but you can already see the morning. It's that in between state, and that's very magical. That's considered very, very magical.
mm,
Midnight, like exactly midnight, because it's not it's not yesterday, but it's not today yet. It's
yeah.
it's a fleeting second where you're kind of in between the 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 bell that announces New Year's Eve, like December 31st into January 1st. There is that second where it's neither. It's
Yeah.
both. It's neither. That's the liminal.
Mm. Yeah. I feel like that's a place where I feel very comfortable in. And I think there's a story in the New Testament where there's a man who wants to be healed, and Jesus is talking to him, and the man says, I believe, but help my unbelief. And I've always felt like I've always felt
Right.
very comfortable in that
Exactly.
space where, like, I believe, maybe I
Right.
don't believe. And I'm in
Right.
this, like, in this middle ground, like 1 foot in the belief door, 1 foot in the
Right.
not belief door. And for whatever reason, I feel at home there, and I feel very comfortable in that space.
Well, one way of looking at the tarot, the first card in the tarot is the Fool.
Hmm.
It's an unnumbered card, and the Fool is on a road, and you can see the tarot as the Fool is on the road, and then it's meeting all the other characters that come up in the next cards, and you can look at life that way. It's a road, and where are we going to go? I've I don't like driving on highways, and one of the things I don't like about driving on highways is you can't stop
Yeah.
and you can't get off. You can only get off where they let you get off. So you're kind of stuck. You're on that road and you got to keep going until the rules let
They say you can get off, right?
but you literally can't.
Yeah.
There's no place to go necessarily, depending on the road. And you know you don't have the choice of, oh, I'll stop here and look around.
Mm,
I don't want to see this. I'll keep going. I'll drive faster. I'll Let me take the detour. Let me do this. Let me do that. And so what kind of the road of your life, what is that life going to be?
mm,
And my mom loved a highway. It was faster. She didn't have to think about where she was going.
mm,
You get on here, you get off there. So, that's not a judgmental thing.
sure.
We all have our paths and our ways
That's
of
right.
doing things.
That's right. Well, Judika, this has been a lot of fun, but we are just about out of time. But I thank you for taking time
Thank
for
you.
me and for our listeners. Thank you for the work you're doing and making it so accessible to so many people.
I hope so. I hope people enjoy it. This is written to be enjoyed.
It definitely is. And real quick, where can people go online if they want to interact any more with you and your work? Any particular place
Oh,
you want to direct us?
I am on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. I'm on I mean, I still call it Twitter. I'm there. Um, I have a website that it's kind of down right now. I mean, some people tell me they access it's liminal. I've been told there's some
There
people
you
that can
go.
access it,
And you're
but
comfortable
also,
there. That's right.
well, it will get repaired eventually.
Sure.
So
Excellent. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes and maybe we can do
thank
this
you.
again.
Thank you. I'd love to. Thank you.
Thank you.